Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alan Deffenderfer. I like to describe myself as a reducer of waste and pain, and that's because I've been through that process. I've had a lot of waste and pain in my FileMaker development career, both at the beginning and in helping customers move through that. Let me say a little bit about myself so that you get to know me. I'm trained as a university professor. I do this sort of stuff every fall and spring at a college classroom. Never quite up on a stage like this, but I'm doing presentations all the time. I've been doing that for over 20 years. But I had a pivot to IT in 2004 where I started to work on a database for myself in my own small business that I spun up at that time. And I became one of the top 25% sellers, Amazon sellers in the country using that database platform. Just me, my automated FileMaker database, and a little book shed that I had in my backyard, if you can imagine that. So a very lean company. I had an application, I started to have an application developed in FileMaker, and it was a failure. I was on the business side, I wasn't the developer, and I was a terrible product owner. I lost $20,000 in that engagement. I took on the project myself, and that's how I became a FileMaker developer. I built it in-house. I attended my first DevCon in 2007, so it's been a decade now. And within 8 months of that meeting, I was working for the FileMaker Platinum in Philly as a subcontractor, and then eventually I went full-time. And I was one of their lead project developers for a while until I had an opportunity to go in-house at the Department of Defense in the fall of 2012, where I worked for 3.5 years in a very highly compliant, or a very highly secure and compliant environment, trying to get FileMaker off the ground. It wasn't an already installed base of FileMaker users. It was trying to spin it up for the first time and make it meet all of the Department of Defense regulations. In 2015, I left that position, and now I'm an independent consultant. Most of my clients are mom and pops and smallish to mid-size businesses. So that's a little bit about my background. I like hiking, biking, and I like brewing beer. Let me take a quick poll. Take a look at this. This is the official definition of personally identifiable information that is used within DoD contexts. How many of you are storing things like names, dates of birth, social security numbers, medical information, financial information, employment information in a FileMaker database? Everyone, right? That's what we do. This is the baseline of what we do. How many of you have ever thought about, I've been in strange conversations in the DoD, ever thought about a primary key as a form of personally identifiable information? Have you been in those discussions as well? Have you thought about what kind of impact that might have when we're using the new REST API as to how that might transfer data back and forth? Well, if you've got PII, let me ask you some questions. How many of you carry error and omission insurance in your business if you're an independent consultant? How many of you have read that policy lately? Do you know if a data breach where PII has been disclosed to an unauthorized party, what that means? Have you looked at that clause in your error and omissions insurance policy lately? Are you covered? Do you know? It scared me when I found out. I'm not. You have to carry a separate cyber insurance policy. How many of you are aware of that? I'm not trying to be scary or anything. I'm just trying to point out these are things that we really need to think about, that the separate cyber insurance policy is something that we all need to think about. And if you're FBA, you know that now there's a requirement for all FBAs to carry general liability insurance, right? So there's this whole tier that we have to be aware of. Well, how many of you are using encryption at rest in any of those systems that carry PII? This is where this presentation got started a little over a year ago at the FileMaker Philly user group when I asked that question, and no one raised their hand at the table. So that's why I'm here today. I'm trying to raise our level of awareness in the community as to how important things like that are. We'll encrypt a FileMaker database. I'm going to take FileMaker starting point from Richard Carlton Consulting and encrypt that for you and sort of walk you through the process and explain the different things that are involved. But before we get there, I want to have a little fun with all of you. I want you to experience what it's like when you show up day one on an Army base and you're trying to figure out how security works. And if you don't know the lingo, you don't know the vocabulary, that's kind of what I want to do for the first third of this, kind of walk you through the terminology and how that works. So when you sit down with clients or you engage with IT at the enterprise level, you have a common vocabulary. You ready to go on this trip? Yeah. It's a scary trip. So I'm not going to read all of this. I've got 2 slides on this to give you some of the basic terminology. But these are so confused, I thought it was really important to be able to walk through this with all of you so that you don't make these mistakes. So we're sort of agreeing as a group to be able to get all this vocabulary down so that we're not making these common mistakes. A threat is different than a vulnerability, is different than impact, and it's different than risk. So I'm going to give you an operational definition, not one that reads all these things off to you. A threat, a circumstance or event that can cause harm to your organization. A threat agent is someone who exploits vulnerabilities who negatively impact your organizational assets. Are you following with me? Threat vectors are the tools that threat agents employ to exploit vulnerabilities. There are lots of examples of this, so lots of tools out there. But one of the funnier stories that I've run across is there was a data center that didn't have particularly strong physical protection around it, and there was a gardener on the outside who accidentally dropped a broomstick down through the fan on the air conditioning. The data center got so hot, everything shut down. In that case, the threat vector was a broomstick, right? There's a lot of ways to think about this. These threat vectors and the threats aren't all necessarily technical things that we can address. We, humans, are the biggest threat to any information system that we encounter. And your users, disgruntled employees, and the insider threat to any organization is one of the biggest threats that we face as a community, especially in the enterprise. So let's take on some other terms. Assets can be both tangible and intangible, and assets are those things that have value to your organization. A process, a computer, intellectual property. That's what you're protecting from threat agents who are exploiting vulnerabilities to attack or compromise your assets. Countermeasures are mitigation strategies that we take to reduce vulnerabilities that threat agents are trying to exploit. Are you following? I mean, you kind of have to pay attention to this one, right? I mean, there's a quiz at the end of this. But this is the language. So threat agents exploit vulnerabilities to attack your assets. We, as an expert FileMaker community, deploy countermeasures and defense-in-depth countermeasures. Defense-in-depth is the concept that it's not just a checklist. How many of you have seen checklists for FileMaker Security and you go through and you check the things off to make sure that they're done? Security is not over at that point. You need to follow those checklists, but security is a mindset. You're constantly thinking about it. Defense in depth is the concept that you narrow your attack surface so that threat agents have smaller and smaller things to be able to attack. But it's in depth in that the amount of countermeasures that you put in place, mitigation strategies that you put in place, is deep, so that if they do gain access to one of your systems, they have to go through several layers of it before they get to anything that is of value. Are you following? So defense in depth is both narrow and deep. That's the idea. Have any of you undergone a risk assessment? Walk through the process, you identify your assets, you look at the potential threats that may be harmful to those assets. Risk assessment prioritizes, identifies, estimates threats and vulnerabilities. And threats and vulnerabilities are not the same thing as risk. Risk is an attempt to measure the impact and the likelihood of a threat or a vulnerability occurring, of a threat occurring and of a vulnerability being exploited. So all these terms are distinct. When as you sit down with your clients, as you sit down, if you're an in-house developer and you sit down with IT or your CSO, the security officer, or the CIO, we've got to first start keeping these terms straight so that we all are on the same page with the folks on the other side of the table. And certainly, if you're an independent developer the way that I am, oftentimes when I'm dealing with mom and pops and mid-sized organizations, I'm generally the only person at the table who's bringing security as something to be discussed at the table. It may only be you, and especially if you're in the sales process, you may be the only person at the table that has this stuff in the back of your mind. So why do we need to do this? Well, let me give you an example. So one time we had a requirement come in the DoD where we had to do emails. So I went out and I did my due diligence and I was doing my research, and I hadn't used a plugin that had the ability to interface with Microsoft Exchange. So I downloaded the demo and I fired it up. And I started playing around with things in the demo, and it was working great. It sucked in all my emails from the Exchange server. And then there was something I realized. As it was pulling in the emails, it got all of my emails. By which I mean, how many of you know that Exchange or that Outlook has the ability to encrypt emails before you send them? Do you use that functionality? You can encrypt stuff. If you have a PKI system set up, a public key interchange system set up within your enterprise, you can exchange emails in a secure way so that other users know that it's you that sent it. It's encrypted, and it's two-factor authentication in most government situations to be able to decrypt one of these. You use a CAC, a common access card, which you plug into a keyboard, and then you use a password that's tied to that key or tied to that CAC. So it's two-factor. And any time in Outlook, to be able to see an encrypted email, you have to click on the email, and it pops up a dialog that says, put in your password. We know it's you from your CAC. Put in a password so that we can decrypt your email and show it to you. When I synced the demo with the Exchange server, it got all of my emails, including the encrypted ones, in plain text. Boy, I shut that thing down fast. I didn't want anybody to know that that had just happened. In fact, I had a meeting with one of the folks that I used to work with in the DoD before I came here to make sure, is all the stuff I'm going to say be okay? And I told him that story, and he said, you never told me that. I said, I was too scared to tell anyone that, right? You never, and that's not a FileMaker issue or a plugin issue, right? That's something that's probably a misconfiguration or a vulnerability that's in Exchange itself where that should not have happened. Do you follow? But yet it was there. But let's use that as an example for a second. Let's say that I am a threat, I'm a disgruntled employee, and now I have the ability to deploy, if my application is then deployed across the enterprise, and the directorate director, the CEO, is using my application, and I have the ability to go grab all their emails. Do you see the potential data spillage here? Now that's if it's intentional. Now imagine you have a citizen developer that did the exact same thing that I did. Are you following? And they didn't know that that was a vulnerability. And then all of a sudden that email gets in there. And they weren't encrypting. And this stuff is being passed around on USB drives and going outside the security network and home with them at night. And you've been hired as the external consultant, and you have to come in, and you have to be able to evaluate what's the risk in that situation. You do a risk assessment, or you should be doing a risk assessment, right? This is how it impacts us. That's why we should be doing these things at this level. This is what a risk assessment looks like from a 50,000-foot view. Not necessarily tied to information technology. You see fire, explosion, all this stuff on that side. Cyber attack is way down here at the bottom. People, your number one asset. And then you measure the impacts. So remember, risk is measuring the likelihood and the impact of exploiting a vulnerability and of a threat occurring. This follows it through. You identify this all the way through. You can go download a sample risk assessment that you can do for your own organization here from this website, or you could work with a client in that way. But let's talk about information security risk. So this is where we get into a few more acronyms. How many of you have seen the CIA Triad? Confidentiality, integrity, and availability. In the world of information science and in IT, this is the backbone of security, protecting the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of a system. So your assets are what you're protecting. These three legs of the triangle are the things that enable us to be able to protect our systems from unauthorized access, from incorrect data modification or improper data modification, and to make our systems available in a timely manner, according to all according to policies that are set by your enterprise. Resilience is a term that's sort of popping up on the field now, or popping up within security now, to describe, I think it's closely related to the idea of defense in depth that I just talked about. The resilience of a system is its ability to be able to stand up and continue to perform at a organizationally defined level while it's under attack, while it's compromised, or while it's degraded in some capacity. That's it for terms. I'm going to be using those terms: threat agent, threats, vulnerabilities, risks, risk assessments, when I talk about the remaining stuff here. So let me tell you a little bit about why I named my talk the way that I did, from a perspective of putting FileMaker inside the Department of Defense. The first thing I realized after we all went to the keynote, right, was that I was a part of bimodal IT. They brought in FileMaker because it was a rapid application development platform, and it could spit stuff out very, very quickly. But it wasn't yet accepted as a enterprise-level tool where they wanted to keep, in other words, we talked about FileMaker being a quick prototyping tool, or the ability to spin up applications that might be replaced later by IT with corporate applications built on top of Java and Oracle. I didn't really realize that until I went to the keynote, that I was in the fast lane. Believe it or not. It didn't feel like it when I was in the DoD, but I was in the fast lane. We were able to spin up several apps within 6 months of being there. That's after having not had any apps in the group that I was in spun up for years. So we were a hit. So in my experience, FileMaker in the DoD was an early and somewhat accidental form of bimodal IT in the fast track, bringing in these rapid application development tools. But I want to say something about another kind of IT, and this is the one that we need to be concerned about in our community. And this is the view of the fast track bimodal IT from a risk-averse community, like insurance companies. So I want to take a look at how so I downloaded a document, and I'll make it available in the material that I provide from this presentation, that describes shadow IT. In my experience, FileMaker in the DoD was viewed as shadow IT. And I'd like to change this perception. Let me give you an example of, or a definition of shadow IT. Shadow IT occurs when, and I want you to think about FileMaker. Shadow IT occurs when users of self-select and self-developed technology assets, both hardware and software, without corporate IT's knowledge or permission, i.e. citizen developers, trying to get work done. Business leaders find its productivity, affordability, and ease of use benefits too compelling to ignore. Does this sound like any application platform you are aware of? This is what's going on. There's this tension in the enterprise about what to do with tools that are just like the ones that we use, FileMaker. How do you bring it in? And bringing it in has security implications. This is from a document shining a light on shadow IT from Travelers Insurance that I'll make available. What do I mean? So that was my experience of bringing FileMaker in. In addition to all the other things, if you've been in large corporate America, knowing how you have to explain FileMaker to traditional IT, that it's a tightly coupled development stack that can't be represented in a text document that you store in Git, right? And it does have a 3-tier application stack, but it's tightly coupled so that you can't take it apart. And I spent all my time doing that. In addition to all those other things, there's the bimodal IT and the shadow IT were the main things. Security is not just a state. It's not a checklist. It's also an ongoing process and a mindset. That's what I'm hoping to transfer to some of you. Like, how many of you thought that just turning on a plugin could lead to such a vulnerability? FileMaker as a platform, though, and this is the great thing, it has hardened its security stance and its security posture. So I was happy as could be when FileMaker 13 came out and we got encryption at rest. That made all kinds of things possible for us that we were never able to do before in the defense space. Once we got encryption at rest, we could store personally identifiable information. We got people in our database for the first time. That was a big shift. So it's hardened its posture, and it's given us a lot of technical controls. But security is not just a technical matter. It also has management and operational controls, meaning that there's a whole other layer above the technical that goes on in the large enterprise. If you were to, for example, study for the CompTIA Security Plus exam, which is what basically is the baseline security certification for anybody that works inside the Department of Defense, you have to have that before you can touch a secure system, really, and work with it in any way. These are the type of things that you have to go through. It's not just technical. There's a whole sets of layers. There are 3 classes, and there are 18 families of security controls that you have to walk through and get familiar with. And it's not just about turning on privilege bits about who can access this record or that. It's also about making sure that the people in HR go on vacation every 2 weeks, and the person who replaces them takes over their job to make sure that they're not doing anything wrong with their job. Or the same thing in the finance department. The same thing in all these other departments. These are all security measures to enforce vacation policy, for example. You may not think of it that way, but those are all security policies that take place in large corporations, part of the management layer. Operational are what happens when you have a data spillage. How do you handle change and configuration management? Those kinds of things. And what I learned about the enterprise, and what I mean by enterprise, is there's micro and small, which is what I deal with now. Many of you are probably in the medium and large, but then there's gigantic. I remember the first month I walked into the DoD, and I said, oh, sure, FileMaker is an enterprise class machine. It's got federated identity management. Let's just hook it up to Active Directory. And they just kind of looked at me and shook their head and said, Alan, we've got posts all across the world that are all in separate Active Directory for us, with millions of users in each one of the Active Directory for us, and we don't have any control over the Active Directory groups, and besides, they're wrong sometimes. And I thought about that, and I said, well, that's an edge case I really didn't plan for. You're coming in here. That's an outlier, right? And that's what I mean by gigantic. It's pushing even enterprise class software like Exchange and Active Directory to its absolute limits. I remember having a discussion at the Find Your Moose conference a couple years ago with Jesse from 360works, the owner of 360works, and I was telling him about this WebDirect app that we were building. And I said, I know that 14 has been out 3 or 4 months, but we can't switch to 14 because it's dropped support for Internet Explorer 9. And Jesse looked at me and said, well, just upgrade to 10. And I thought about that. Well, that would affect, I don't know, 10, 20 million workstations just on this side of the continent. And that's what I mean by gigantic. That was the space in which we found ourselves implementing FileMaker. So I'm trying to give you that context. But enterprises of all sizes use these frameworks and standards. How many of you have a solution that falls into one of these crazy frameworks? HIPAA. How many of you were at the presentation that Ray Colligan gave back? I think it was back in 2009. He was talking about different graphing methods. And he said the great thing about standards is that there's so many of them. Right? This is what we're up against, and this is what FileMaker is now being introduced into. And we now know that FileMaker is in the enterprise. This is what we as a community have to start getting familiar with. I'm going to focus on a couple of these, and I want you to walk through the process. So this is kind of it for the formal stuff. I want you to walk through, I'm going to bring up some STIGs. We have a lot of acronyms in the DoD. I'm going to bring up a STIG. A STIG is a Security and Technical Implementation Guide that you have to follow before you can deploy any application on the network. And I'm only want to do 4 of them. So let me pull this up here. This is from the Database Security Requirements Guide. So the requirement, and again, there's only 4, but I want us to wrap our heads around these about how we might try to make FileMaker, help FileMaker deploy in an environment like this. The requirement is, in addition to the other things, that if you're going to secure FileMaker, that is, turn on SSL for data on the wire in transit, you have to make it available for a device to be able to decrypt it, inspect every packet as it's going through, and then re-encrypt it on its way to where it's going. Now that's not particularly challenging except that in the DoD environment, we don't use GoDaddy certificates, right? What do you do when you have to install a custom certificate inside? And this is actually a question I cannot answer because FileMaker 16 is a game changer on this front. And I haven't seen what it will take to deploy 16 inside that environment and how it will accept a DoD certificate. But they do not make those available outside their security zone. But everything within it is set up to be able to handle it. FileMaker 12, when you install the DoD SSL certificate, when it would start up, would not recognize it as authoritative in any way and override it with the default one. FileMaker 13 began to accept them, and FileMaker 14 did as well. But I'm not sure with the changes in 16 to how the certificate authorities work, how it will actually work now. We had to implement separation of duties. This was mind-blowing to me when I first. What this meant in our environment was developers are distinct from DBAs, which are distinct from system administrators. None of them can overlap in terms of their privileges to be able to access a system. The way it worked was that if you were a Java or a Cold Fusion developer, you would write a SQL script that would go in and alter the database that you would hand off to a DBA who would run it against the DBA schema to make those changes in sort of an off-site copy. And then if it was approved by the DBA, it would then be run against the development database, and that's how you would create a field. This is what we were up against, and you can imagine what that would be like for a FileMaker developer. Do you follow? How do you implement that kind of separation of duties? We didn't. We had to get an exception to this, and that's one of the reasons why we had to go through so much security training to be able to do this. We did separate out the system administration component, but we had to train everyone on how FileMaker worked at that level. And it was a Linux the preference was a Linux environment. So spinning up a Windows box was not something that anybody enjoyed doing in our group to do this. What's that? So those were a couple of things that we dealt with. Let's look at the application security development checklist. Now this one's really weird. I have to explain this one a little bit. What does it mean that, so there are all these things about you have to protect against SQL injection, you have to parameterize statements, and you can't concatenate this, but it does not directly access the tables of a database. And I remember reading this for the first time. What does that even mean? And I was thinking about it from a FileMaker perspective. Does it mean that if I'm using a layout that's based on a TO, is a TO really the table? Do you see the process I was going through? No, it's a table occurrence. It's not really the underlying table. But that's not really what they were talking about here. As I learned more about what this specific requirement is about, is that in the world of SQL, nobody was able to write directly to the table. They had to use a view. And we don't have this idea in FileMaker directly. But a view is really a predetermined find that is instantiated in the database that users have privileges to and can make queries against. I mean, the only way I can think to describe it in FileMakerese is to say a virtual list on a record with a on-record load with a perform find. Does that make sense? In other words, it's sort of different but it has the ability to write. But the requirement was this. Users should have no access to the security objects of the table object. That's the idea. They can't alter, they can't grant, select, update. If you're from SQL, they can't do that with the table. Or the virtual table, or the view. They can't do that with that. How could I pull that off in FileMaker? Well, I thought about it a little bit, and really, what is insert, create, delete? Well, those are set field, new record. Do you follow? And all those are controlled in the privilege set, and all those are controlled in the file that has the data. So if I simply did data separation and moved the view to a separate file, then there was no way for a user who had access to that file to be able to have access to the security objects that controlled. Are you following? This was blowing my mind to have to think about how to translate this stuff into how it might work in FileMaker. But this is one of the things that we had to deal with. How did we make that happen? So we went with data separation on nearly everything just to be compliant with this. Now, this wasn't something we were told to be compliant where we could. And of course, I wanted a job. So I did it everywhere I could because I wanted the platform to be able to stick. Let's take a look at a fourth one. Application must be capable of host-based boundary protection mechanisms for servers, workstations, and devices. Every endpoint, every host, every workstation, every server has a firewall. Has virus protection. Has a configuration script that turns off all the things that you're not supposed to be able to do. How many of you have used from seed code their SQL Builder? What's it called? Is it called SQL Builder? SQL Explorer. I remember using that, and there was some update that they did that changed how they presented the results of the query in a web viewer. You know, at the end screen, if you've ever seen that tool, you sort of go through and you build your SQL query, and then at the end, you get a portal down, or it appears to be a portal down at the bottom, but it's really a web viewer. And they changed the HTML code in the web viewer to render faster, or some cool way that seed code likes to do. And I remember firing up that for the first time on my computer, and it didn't work at all. My workstation in the DoD. Because everything that had just been implemented, or whatever it was that was implemented in the code in that web viewer, had been turned off in the operating system in my instance of IE. You following? These are all the things that we were bumping up against. We found that the web viewer was an unreliable resource to be able to do data rendering, because we never knew from day to day what type of security protocols would be implemented from the last night's security push. So these are the kinds of things that we were up against. Let's take a look at, so those all have deployment. This is the deployment track, right? Those all have deployment ramifications, don't they? So here's FileMaker's documentation on the recommended deployment options for FileMaker. The top one is just the single database. You don't have anything extra turned on, and you access it through the admin console. And then all your client types would be around that. The second one is, here's one with the web publishing engine turned on, and now you're able to offer WebDirect and PHP with the admin console on the side. And then you get a multi-server deployment down here, and we get our first indication that there's some sort of security that may be involved by the brick wall here that represents a firewall. And here's the database server with all of this stuff running, and we have the admin console. And here's a worker machine that has a web server with the web publishing engine. And that's the documentation. Well, I started to pull together. Let me find it. What this might look like if we were to follow STIGs, Security and Technical Implementation Guides. I'm just going to give you 15 seconds to look at this. Have any of you ever mapped your network like this before? Try to figure out how you're going to try to make things work? This isn't, I don't pretend that this is formal in any way. I use an online graphing tool, then I don't have all the correct objects to be able to display this, but I put up what it might look like from a FileMaker perspective. How many of you are familiar with the concept of a DMZ, a demilitarized zone? Good. Let me explain this a little bit. Let me use my laser pointer here. So let me just start here in the DMZ, because it's kind of the simplest of this is the first layer of things that you might deploy outside your local LAN. So in a STIG-compliant environment, so this Security and Technical Implementation Guide in the Army, you cannot have any communication taking place between your DMZ and your LAN. It's a category violation. You'll be shut down. So that's why you don't see any intercommunication between these two things. You will always have to separate, and I should have a firewall. I did put it here, but you should have a firewall between those two, because anything that says Apache or IIS has to be firewalled off. One of the rules, in fact, in proper Windows server configuration inside of STIGs is that IIS should be shut off when it's not being used. Imagine our surprise every morning when we were coming in and our WebDirect application took about 3 minutes to fire up, waiting for everything to come back online because the server had been STIGged to be taken offline. These are all rules you can go read about online, by the way. The FileMaker database I was showing you were things that you can just go download. So this is the DMZ. This is the outside, right? The internet. And you've got your Go clients, your FileMaker Pro clients, your Pro Advanced, and web browsers. Do you see the red around all of these? Host-based firewalls. Virus checking. Configuration management. All these things are on for all of these endpoints in this context. And here within the system, here within the LAN, NIDS, Network Intrusion Detection Systems, these large ones, NIPS, Network Intrusion Protection Systems or Prevention Systems, to be able to prevent malicious stuff from being able to come into your network. And it's mandated that anywhere, again, that there's an Apache or an IIS server, it's firewalled off from the database. Are you kind of following the complexity here? A proxy is used for web apps to be able to authenticate people. So there's a proxy server that puts in authentication headers on in every HTTPS request to identify who you are. It's single sign-on. Many large corporations have this kind of system. Has anybody bumped into this? A handful of you have. They use their own internal authentication systems. We figured out how to make WebDirect compliant with this, interestingly enough. and a NIPS here. Enclaves for each environment, this would be replicated for every environment from which you're deploying. So if you have a development environment, a staging environment, a user acceptance environment, and a production environment, this would be replicated. This right here would be replicated 4 times. Are you kind of following? This is what it would look like from a STIG compliant perspective. So STIGs are a mitigation strategy for risk. So responses to risk are numerous. I've got them highlighted up here. You can avoid risk, you can mitigate it, you can share it, you can transfer it, or you can accept it. These are the standard. I mean, there are others, and they can be categorized slightly different ways, but these are pretty standard. You accept the risk when you just don't care, right? And you just accept all the risk by not taking any security precautions whatsoever. You can avoid the risk by not doing anything, or trying not to do anything. Mitigating the risk is lowering the impact of exploits through vulnerabilities. And it's usually by lowering the possibility of a vulnerability being exploited. That's the way to say it. That's what mitigating does. And all of the STIGs are about mitigating that risk. Sharing the risk, well, let me put these two together. So we have insurance. If you have insurance at all, you're transferring the risk of whatever it is that you're doing to some other organization, right? That's the idea of transferring. Sharing the risk is, from the insurance company's perspective, pooling all of us, FileMaker developers, into a big pool and basically saying, let's let them share the risk among them and we'll pay out only when needed. That's the idea. And STIGs are a part of this mitigation strategy. Well, do you know what else mitigates risk? Encryption at rest. Let's encrypt a popular database system. You ready? How many of you have seen FileMaker Starting Point? How many of you use it at all? There's a handful of you that have looked at it. Let me go ahead and set that down. So on my desktop here, I've got a copy, and I'm going to go ahead and open it up. And I'm going to use the local version. I upload it once I encrypt it. So it's just admin. We're not trying to do anything fancy here. So in your particular context, being able to turn on encryption at rest to mitigate the threat. Now, there are a lot of threats that get mitigated here, but let me give you the most common one. You know, and this came from Mark Richmond's presentation just before this one on Security 101. All it takes is $50 and a copy of your database, and I can crack it. Right? And encryption at rest solves that issue. You can't crack a database that's encrypted. And if you have anything of value in there, and certainly if you're a FileMaker company that puts in personally identifiable information, you need to think about encrypting internally and with your clients. It's a disservice not to at least put that up on the table and have a discussion with the business owners about. Encrypting is actually pretty easy. The only scare tactic that I was kind of prepared to use to talk about this is that none of us want to be that FileMaker shop that's in the courtroom saying, well, there was a data breach and all their data was exfiltrated out of their system, and I didn't take the 10 minutes that it would take in order to encrypt the database. Because that's really all it is. None of us want to be that dev shop. None of us want to be that in-house developer that has to have that conversation. So what do we need to do that? And the only thing that we need to do, and I need to get my mouse to do this because my fingers don't work on the being able to zoom in, and I know that you'll want to be able to see this zoomed in, is what do we need to do? Under the Tools menu, select developer utilities. So let me go ahead and close this. I wanted you to see what it looked like. Select developer utilities. And this is the screen you'll see. I'm sure most of you have seen this sort of thing and played around with it. All you have to do to encrypt a database is add. I'm going to go right to my desktop, go to my FileMaker starting point directory. Now, you will have moved it off of the server. There are a couple of caveats that you need to think about when you're doing this. You'll want to move it off the server, so unhost it, move it off the server. You might, depending on what your practices are within the company, you might want to run a backup and work from the backup, however it is that your management policies prescribe that you do this. If you have external container storage turned on, meaning you're storing your container data outside of your FileMaker database, you will also want to move the directory with all of those image files. Are you following? Put it all in a place, and you select the file that you want to encrypt, and in a multi-file solution, you would select all of them. Again, I'm kind of speaking broadly, but assuming that you want to encrypt all of your files if you have a multi-file solution with the same encryption password and shared key. That would be the caveat I would put in. And you simply add them to the list of things that you're going to encrypt. You select a folder where you want it to be saved, and I'm going to put that in the encrypted directory. And then you select here from some options. And all you have to do is click that to select what it is that we want to do. Now, I'm going to not explain this right now, but for those of you in highly compliant environments, you might need to go read about remove admin access from files permanently if you have compliance regulations that require developer access or DBA access or the ability to be able to modify schema be removed from production environments. But this is something you would want. This is something you might select at the same time whenever you're deploying to a production environment, say maybe in a bank or in the DoD or some other place where you would want this removed. It does some other things in addition to that. It does some things with custom functions and other things that help make the file more secure. And this isn't a swallow this pill and it does everything for you either. If you haven't properly designed your solution, like understand what running a script with full access privileges means, you can still mess all of this up. It doesn't take away that ability, right? And if you explicitly grant permission to be able to manage database to a privilege set, they can still do that. All these things, are you following? This stuff can be overridden. Getting rid of the admin and full access account doesn't get rid of all the problems that you might think that it does. You have to read about this and think about it carefully. But I'm going to go ahead and click OK. Oh, and I should mention down at the bottom, if you want to not encrypt your externally stored container data, you have the option to do it here, but FileMaker is no longer in a permissive state. It is in a restrictive state. And we've talked about that was in the opening keynote, and it's been in several presentations here at DevCon. This is a good thing from my perspective. This is a good thing. You can continue to keep open storage if you need to. And one thing I'll say about I haven't done a encryption password yet. One thing I'll say about the shared ID is that for single file solutions, this makes a lot of sense. Or if you're pushing a whole stack of files at the same time, this makes a lot of sense. This primarily, from our point of view, is just a way to have a shared key when you upload your solution stack, whether it's one file or many, up to the server. That shared key is what allows you to enter in an encryption key, and all the other files that have the shared key will be opened with one instance of the encryption key. In other words, you just have to paste it into FileMaker server once. I'll show you how this works. But then the shared key of all the other files open with the same encryption key. So if you have a 50-file solution, you don't have to put in 50 encryption keys. You put in one encryption key. Yeah? So my experience is, sure, with the same shared key. Did everybody hear that? And the same encryption key, of course. And I cannot speak as to whether this is a best practice. This is sort of new in some ways, as to what files, if you have a shared full stack solution with a shared key, I have swapped out files even without pushing the whole stack. Is everybody kind of following what that means? You might also, depending again on your compliance issues that you have in your particular situation, you might also need to come in here and remove database encryption if, say, you have a requirement that your staging servers or your staging area, it may contain production data and therefore be required to be encrypted. If your process is to move from dev to staging to production, you may have to unencrypt your staging databases if they're the authoritative copy that you'll be moving to production, and move them into production and probably re-encrypt them with a separate encryption password that's only on production. Does that make sense? It's probably not a good idea to share your encryption password across environments.
I'm sorry, what's the shared ID again?
It's just a way for FileMaker to know how many files it should open up with an encryption key. And now it's more than that, but from our perspective, that's really what we need to know about it. That's the great thing about it.
Can the layout on an encrypted file be edited?
Sure.
No.
Yeah. Assuming the user has privileges. Assuming the user has privileges to do that. So, and then I think this is really cool. You can put in up to 100 characters here. I don't think that that's documented, and I haven't tested it in 16 yet. I didn't do it before. But when I was doing my demo at the user group, I just kept hitting keys until it told me I couldn't go any further. And I think you can put up to 100 characters for your password in here. I'm open to correction on that. But I'm going to use, what I think is impressive is I'm going to use a password that is DoD compliant. 15 characters, very complex. Yeah. Does everybody see that? That only gains the modest acknowledgement as moderate within the new FileMaker password suggestion system. That's my term. I'm not going to put in a hint. I'm going to use that. And I'm going to click OK. Now, I could, if I wanted to save a configuration file of this. It will not save your encryption password for obvious reasons. You would never save that in plain text on a drive or anything here, but it will save your solution stack should you be doing this a lot, or if you have a 50-file solution and you don't want to be selecting them all the time. And I'm going to click Create. I'm going to go to my encrypted directory. And where am I on time? We only got about 5 minutes left. Less? 3? 7? Okay, we're on. There may be questions and everything, but this is the very last thing. So if you open this locally now, this is what you'll be presented with. You'll have to have the encryption key before you open it up locally, which we have to do to be able to host it. Then you will be prompted for your credentials. Then I'm going to go over here and I'll turn on the status toolbar where I get this little cheat thing that I use all the time, upload to FileMaker server, which I have running locally on my laptop. And now I have favorite hosts. Let me show you something just as a security point. Right? Does everybody see? When I say you should turn on, that there is a recommendation to turn on a firewall and block down ports, this is partly why, right? So I don't think I have it set up. I'm going to have to find mine out of that whole list, which is this. And I didn't buy a security certificate for obvious reasons. I'm using the built-in one from FileMaker, so I'm going to connect. Oh, I guess I have to put in my credentials. Then I can connect. Then it's going to ask me, where do you want to put it? And I'm not going to put it in the main database folder. I've already got something set up for FileMaker starting point. I'm going to click OK. and it says it's encrypted, but a server administrator must open the file after it's uploaded. So in other words, it's not going to automatically insert in my encryption password when I do this. But it will upload the file. It'll set the privileges that it needs to be able to do this. This is why we upload, right? It sets all the privilege bits correctly, like turning on FileMaker, the FMP privilege bit.
That message you just had one or two before, is that if you're hosting, if you're using independent hoster to host your solution, do they have to have the encryption password then?
Well, let me talk about that. So I'll talk about that right now. So there's my database. Does everybody see that it's closed? Now, this really depends on the hosting service you're used. If they have removed the FileMaker console from your ability to, from you being able to see this, yeah, you'll probably have to put your password into something that they're controlling somehow. But if you have the ability to interact directly with the FileMaker console, the FileMaker server console, when you click open, you're going to be prompted for a password. And if this were a 50-file stack, you would only need to enter this once. Say again? No, when you restart the server, you do not. Depending on how you have your database configuration set, like to auto-open databases, if that is set in FileMaker Server, this stuff will just fire up.
That's not how it works. If your server restarts, you have to go into the admin console and put in the encryption password again. It will not open a file that's been encrypted again.
Well, I just saved it, and mine does it all the time. Yeah. Yeah, if you don't save the encryption password, so this will go to your question and maybe help. When I click Save Password, it's not saving it in plain text or clear text somewhere on the file system that somebody could get access to. You have to think of this as kind of a digital wallet. So you have to check that checkbox to save the password. Once it's saved, that password gets keyed to your shared key. Then every file that you just uploaded that has that shared key will spin up and be unencrypted with that password every time you start FileMaker Server. Every time it's, you can toggle it and turn it on and off. Now, you will be prompted every time if you don't save the password because it doesn't know what it is.
What you just said there, every time it opens it up, it decrypts it?
Yes.
So when it's live and open, it's not encrypted?
When it's in use. So let's make a distinction. Data on the wire through SSL is encrypted with SSL certs. Data at rest on the disk is encrypted. Then there's data in use. Get the difference? So data in use is what you have in your session while you're accessing it. There may be encryption standards that you have. There certainly are in the DoD if you're dealing with certain kinds of information, like confidential information and above as a security class. You have, while it's in use, you have to provide encryption, which we now can do in FileMaker given the new encrypt functions. You kind of have to think about it like this, and I'm not a FileMaker. Yeah, I mean, that's a good FileMaker question, but my understanding is once the file gets, that there's a layer above the file, if this is the file system, there's a layer of translation taking place, and then everything above that, it's in use, it's unencrypted. But on the file, so every copy of this file is encrypted so that basically it would take a long time to crack one of these files. It encrypts in AES 256, which is a FIPS 140.2 compliant standard, which means that practically every part of the United States government would accept that. That's the way to think about that. Question? We had a question back here, and then we'll come up.
And actually, please come up here and ask your questions
Excellent.
from the microphone, because nobody is going to be able to hear it on the recording otherwise. So
Excellent, thank you.
please come here and ask.
Is that
I was just
Jonathan?
saying, and you may have already showed
Thank
this,
you.
but if your server restarts or you close the file, you have to go through that process again.
If you haven't saved the password.
Well, even if you have saved the password, you have to log in as the administrator through the console and set it again. Set the password. Oh, I wasn't watching. You checked the box?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
So if you don't check that box and it's
Yeah,
restarted.
you'll be endlessly putting in passwords. If it's a
Well,
big solution.
if your server has a 100% uptime, you'd never have to do it.
Yeah. So yeah, ideally. Let me give you one caveat though. If you uninstall, so sometimes we get patches in FileMaker where we have to uninstall the server, right? And to reinstall a new version of server. When that happens, FileMaker rightly removes the digital wallet. Did that just make sense? Rightly. So if you've saved your passwords and we have an update, and I don't know if this will change. I don't have insight into how the update process will continue to work. We haven't had a full update for some time where you have to uninstall a version of server to install a new version of server. It's been a while since we've done that, I think. The last one we got on 16 was just a patch. But if you do that, it will remove your digital wallet that has all your encryption passwords in it. And when you install the new version of server, the first time you host any encrypted files, you will have to put it back in at that point and save the password again in the new instance of FileMaker server.
I have two questions. First, hopefully fast. Is there any kind of performance hit on large database files, like a 20 gigabyte or 30 gigabyte solution?
So the book database that I used to run is a 37 gigabyte solution with, and I don't actually keep it updated anymore, but I did test it. And in my experience on my Mac Mini that I keep at home for internal stuff, 5 to 10% tops.
Okay.
Does that help?
Yeah.
I mean, but that's just me, and that's not doing anything really big and complex. But it is big.
Second question, go ahead.
Go up to the microphone, please. That way.
Yeah, sure.
Excellent.
My question was, is that opening the file that you see that increase in time or interacting
No,
with
it's constantly encrypting and decrypting as users are doing things. So that's just, you think of it as overhead. The way that SSL over the wire is overhead.
So the other question, we're going to have a multi-file solution where one of those databases we're going to have protected information in. Can you mix that, have one file encrypted while the others are open for speed purposes?
The answer is yes. The question would be, boy, that sounds dangerous to me. And the reason is, if you have file references to an encrypted database from an unencrypted file, that might be a security vulnerability. Do you follow?
Yeah.
And certainly, if you haven't checked require full access privileges in the security settings to be able to make references to a file, then encryption would be doing you no good at all. So it's part of a package. It's not a magic pill. What other questions do you folks have? Yeah.
Can you talk at all about field level encryption?
Well, yes. Yes, but that's a really new thing in FileMaker 16 to be able to use these new hash functions. So what I can say there is that I'm not sure if, so we get AES 128 level encryption with being able to do stuff with fields and variables and things that we can encrypt. The real issue that I haven't solved yet, and I'm hoping that we get a demo file or something, I've seen something floating around that FileMaker has been using in-house about how to do key management. That's going to be the trick in all of this. How do you store your keys? And I haven't really talked about that even with the FileMaker, encryption keys that we have here. That you have to have some sort of configuration management process or system that you use to manage that. And that's only going to multiply when it comes to encrypting fields at the field level within a solution. How do you do that? And I don't know how we're going to do that just yet. I've seen people trying to use custom functions for that. I've seen several different, and I'm not buying into any of them just yet. So I don't know if I answered your question, but that's where I think that stands. They're pretty powerful features, but it's the key management that's going to be the trick. How do we handle that? And that's not unique to us, right? All databases have this kind of issue. You can't store the key as plain text in a field to unlock the other field. It's just a rabbit hole that you go down, right? So you have to have some sort of digital wallet somewhere that's where it's handling it for you. I don't know how we're going to build that yet. What other questions? Are you all going to encrypt? Yeah. What's a threat? Aha. Go back, take a look at the slides. If you engage with clients at all, be sure to, to keep that terminology in mind and know that encryption at rest is very easy to pull off. It's easy to implement, and it's really not that hard to manage unless you're doing updates every day. Then unencrypting and re-encrypting in a highly complex environment might be hard, but it's really not that hard to manage. So this session, let me go ahead and put this back up here. This session is going to have updates, and I will make them available on the FileMaker site. Right here, it will have updates. And a few things that I'm going to include are some demo files. How many of you, let me just ask a quick question. I know we're a little bit past time. How many of you have a really complex multi-file solution and you've tried to figure out how to make it work with something like data separation and all of that? That's something that I had prepped for this talk. But the more I heard Andy Lecate's presentation about shadow IT and all of that and the relationship between those two, I reshaped this a little bit to fit that because I thought it might dovetail a little bit more. But I've got a lot of ideas and some things that I can actually share with about how a multi-file solution might actually work or not work in a highly complex environment. I mean, I don't know, 50, 60 solution files and how you're trying to do all of that, how you separate out data and how you do data separation vertically and horizontally and how you have little utility files to do things, how that might actually work. So I'm more than happy to share that as well. So this will have updates. Oop. This went all the way back. This is all it's supposed to say. Thank you. Please remember to fill out your forms. And please, if there's anything that I can help you with, I'm happy. I mean, I'm just like you. I've been in one of these environments trying to figure it out. And there are no sure answers. But I'm happy to help give you what I learned.